When giants point fingers, Trump, Nigeria, and the question of genocide. Night falls over a continent. Across bustling cities and rural farmlands in Nigeria, routines once reliable have grown fragile. In the quiet of dawn, farmers raise their heads with caution. Markets close early. Villages know fear not just as a visitor, but a haunting resident. Then, the world jolts. The President of the United States publicly warns that military action could follow in Nigeria if attacks on Christians don't stop. A superpower issue suddenly tied to remote villages, contested data, diplomacy, and religion. This is the story of how violence in Nigeria became a global spotlight. How one leader's declaration reshaped diplomacy, stirred fear, and reopened questions of justice, sovereignty, and faith.
Nigeria is Africa's most populous country. Over 200 million people, more than 200 ethnic groups, divided roughly between a Muslim majority north and a Christian majority south. Over the past 2 decades, the country has faced multiple overlapping security challenges. The Islamist insurgency of Boko Haram and its offshoot Islamic State West Africa province, bandit and kidnapping networks, farmer-herder conflicts in the Middle Belt, separatist movements, and local communal violence tied to land and resources. One widely reported incident. In June 2025, gunmen attacked the central Nigeria village of Yelwata, killing around 100 people and displacing thousands. Counting the victims of violence across Nigeria is difficult. Reporting is inconsistent. Many rural communities are isolated and motives of attackers are mixed. Some advocacy groups point to thousands of Christian deaths. Others emphasize that many victims are Muslim and that religious targeting is only one part of a broader pattern of criminal and communal violence. In short, the ground truth is complex. But what changed was the move from local tragedy to international headline.
On October 31 to November 1, 2025, the US government took 2 major steps. First, they added Nigeria to their countries of particular concern list for religious freedom violations. Second, the US president publicly declared he was ordering the Pentagon to prepare for possible military operations in Nigeria if Nigerian government did not act to stop what he described as the killing of thousands of Christians. He warned that aid could be cut, that troops on the ground or airstrikes were possible, and used the language "guns ablaze." When asked on Air Force One whether troops or airstrikes might be used, the president said, "Could be. I mean, other things. I envisage a lot of things. They are killing record numbers of Christians in Nigeria. We're not going to allow that to happen." For many watching, this marked a dramatic escalation. Violence in Nigeria, already ongoing for years, had now become a potential trigger for US military action.
The reaction in Nigeria was swift and firm. The government rejected the framing that the state was behind the persecution of Christians. President Bola Ahmed Tinubu stated that the characterization of Nigeria as religiously intolerant does not reflect our national reality. A presidential advisor, Daniel Bwala, said Nigeria welcomed US assistance in fighting insurgents so long as the country's territorial integrity and sovereignty was respected. He also suggested the US threat might be part of a broader negotiation rather than an imminent invasion. Public reaction among Nigerians ranged from relief, "at least we are being noticed," to fear, "what if foreign troops appear?" Some Christians were relieved by the attention, others worried about inflaming tensions. Analysts warned that the situation was far more than a simple Christian versus Muslim scenario.
Let's survey the key perspectives. US policymakers and faith groups. Evangelical Christian networks and some US lawmakers pressed for action, citing what they called Christian mass murder in Nigeria. Conservative leaders say the violence has been ignored for too long. Nigerian government calls for dignity and rejects being portrayed as a state sponsor of religious violence. emphasizes multi-faith coexistence and constitutional protections for all Nigerians. Conflict analysts caution that while Christians are victims, many Muslims are also killed, and that mapping violence purely along religious lines ignores underlying causes such as land disputes, governance failure, and resource stress. Regional and international actors emphasize Nigeria's sovereignty, warn against unilateral military intervention, and call for multilateral legal frameworks for any foreign involvement.
Why does this matter on multiple levels? Economically, Nigeria is Africa's largest economy and a major oil producer. Threats of sanctions or military escalation impact investor confidence, aid flows, and the ability of the state to fund security and social services. Resource and land. Many of the conflicts occur in Nigeria's middle belt, where farmers and herders clash over shrinking land, water, grazing routes, and climate change. These aren't always framed as religious but can easily be narrated so. The risk? Misdiagnosing motives means misdeploying solutions. Ethically and humanitarianly, the question, do we intervene when large-scale violence occurs, is not new. Foreign military intervention carries grave risks, civilian casualties, displacement, and the collapse of local trust. Ethical responses require protecting civilians first, not simply pursuing headlines. Religiously, painting the struggle purely as Christians versus Muslims undervalues the diversity of Nigeria's faiths and identities. It can inflame rather than calm. Some analysts suggest that the Christian genocide label lacks reliable data and meaningful intent to eradicate a faith group as such. Politically and corruption. The Nigerian state has struggled to enforce the rule of law, prosecute perpetrators, and allocate resources evenly. These failures create vacuums where violence thrives. External pressure can help, but cannot substitute for domestic reforms. Borders and regional security. Nigeria's porous borders and regional militant flows make any threat of foreign military involvement complicated. Without coordination with regional neighbors and respect for sovereignty, escalation may backfire.
What are the potential scenarios? 1. Diplomatic pressure plus targeted sanctions. The US and allies could apply economic and visa sanctions on identified individuals, condition aid on improvements in community security and religious freedom reporting. 2. Security cooperation, non-combat assistance, training, intelligence sharing, equipping local forces with human rights conditions. This supports sovereignty, but may lack immediate headline impact. 3. Humanitarian peace-building surge. Focus on community mediation, land use reform, agricultural resilience, local peace structures. Far less dramatic, but potentially more durable. 4. Military intervention. Direct US boots or airstrikes. The most dramatic, highest risk path. Without clear targets, intelligence, regional consent, and exit plans, it could destabilize rather than stabilize.
Let's return to personal stories. A farmer in the Middle Belt wakes to find his fields burned. A mother whose children no longer run freely to the river. A church that once opened its doors to worship now opens its doors to shelter fleeing families. These are the humans behind the headlines. One such incident in Yelwata. The next morning, the farmer returned to his compound to find the charred body of his wife and 4 children. Such grief demands attention, but attention without nuance can mislead.
How should we think about the term genocide? Internationally, genocide demands proof of intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a protected group because of their identity. Some US lawmakers claim Nigeria has allowed or facilitated the killing of Christians on just such a scale. But conflict analysts caution that the violence in Nigeria is multifaceted. Location often matters more than faith, and many victims are Muslims. Labeling it genocide without rigorous proof risks politicizing pain and misdirecting solutions.
Legal and sovereignty questions loom large. Under international norms, sovereignty is cornerstone. Yet, the doctrine of the responsibility to protect ROTP suggests that when a state fails to protect its citizens from mass atrocities, the international community has a duty to act, ideally multilaterally and with UN backing. But a unilateral threat by one nation risks undermining the rules that govern global order. Nigeria says it wants help, but not at the cost of being reduced to a battleground for foreign agendas.
Media framing matters. The image of Christian massacre travels faster and captures headlines. But when complexity is lost, so is understanding. Local journalists operate under risk, with limited access, and must navigate local politics. The risk: global audiences see simplified stories, which become the basis for policy decisions. We must ask, are we seeing a war of religion or a war of failed institutions, territorial disputes, resource stresses, and insurgency? Probably the latter, but with religious undertones.
What do stakeholders want and fear? Nigerian government, protection for its citizens, foreign assistance, respect for sovereignty. Fear, being painted as a failed state, foreign boots cracking jokes of quick fixes. Victims and local communities, safety, justice, ability to return home. Fear, being ignored or used as pawns. Religious leaders want recognition of victimhood, but fear polarization of faiths. US policymakers want to show moral leadership and respond to constituent pressure. Fear, unintended consequences, overreach. Regional actors want stability, avoid foreign interventions that undermine local control. Analysts and NGOs want accurate counting, accountability, reform. Fear mounting rhetoric with no follow-through.
The long view, lasting solutions. No quick fix. The path ahead. 1. Justice and accountability. Investigate attacks, prosecute perpetrators, end impunity. 2. Local conflict mediation. Empower traditional and community leaders to negotiate land, pasture, grazing rights. 3. Economic inclusion, jobs, education, community infrastructure to reduce allure of insurgency. 4. Security reform, modernize, professionalize, civilian oversight of forces. 5. Climate and land adaptation, water management, crop diversification, support for farmers and herders. 6. Interfaith dialogue, trust building across lines of faith and ethnicity. These are not glamorous, they are slow, but for Nigeria and for the world, they matter most.
The stage is set. A message to Nigeria from a global superpower. A country grappling with violence that spares no faith. A world watching. For those living in Nigeria, the question remains, who will guard tomorrow? For the international community, how to help without harming. For those viewing from afar, the crisis travels beyond borders and demands more than shock headlines. We end not with answers, but with questions and a determination. May the next chapter be one of rebuilding and not repeating. May the victims be remembered not simply as statistics, but as lives worth restoring. And may the promise of support match the depth of the need.
Thank you for watching. AfrorizeTV invites you to stay engaged. Subscribe for in-depth investigations, contextual reporting, and stories that connect African realities to global dynamics.